Welcome everyone. This is a video showing how to mix up Keto Chow using butter. Now to do this you're going to need to use hot water and you're going to be using, well in this case, melted butter. I'm using salted butter that I got from Sam's Club, just butter. And for my particular calorie requirements I'm doing right now, I'm using 200 grams of butter. Now, the way that I figured this out was I put 3 meals worth of Keto Chow into Chronometer, and then I added butter, and I just kept on upping the number until the calories said the amount that I wanted. It's actually that easy. Usually when I'm telling people to start off, I recommend they start with a half of a stick of butter. If I remember correctly, that should give you about, it ends up being around 1,600 calories a day, which divided by 3, I think it's, oh dang, I'm not doing the math in my head right now. I think it's like 550 or 600 or something like that calories per meal. But anyway, you'll want to use the appropriate amount for you. I don't have a cool calculator to figure it out, but any tracking program should be able to tell you. And it's a lot easier to calculate if you use a scale. That way you can just, in this case, I had a measuring cup. I just cut butter. I've actually got the remnants of my butter here. I just cut it up and just kept adding it. In 200 grams that I'm doing is rather close to a half of a stick per meal. So I'm using about a stick and a half. In this case, it's actually about a stick and 3/4. That gives me 1,830 calories a day. Anyway, so I've got a 1 gallon pitcher here. I've got a bunch of warm water. I've got an immersion blender. Now you could also just use a blender. I would not recommend using a closed blender like a Ninja just because you're going to be using warm water. It would probably be fine unless you're using hot water. But I personally like to just use the immersion blender because it's really easy. So I've got all my ingredients ready to go, which is the butter, the immersion blender, a thing to mix it in, warm water, and then the Keto Chow. I'm going to do chocolate to start off, and I'll explain why in just a bit. And I'm doing 3 meals of Keto Chow at the same time. If you were using a smaller blender, you could do a single meal. This allows me to do 3 rather quickly, all at the same time. And the reason why I'm using a blender and why I'm using warm water with the butter is because the blender, along with the acacia gum that's in the Keto Chow, is going to emulsify the butter, and it's just going to mix it in really well. So it'll work really good. So anyhow, yeah, and the reason why I'm using a gallon pitcher is because here the 2-quart line is exactly half full, so it doesn't spray all over the place. So to start off, here we go. Start your engines. I'm gonna put just a little bit of the warm water into the water pitcher, and that's just to keep the butter from hitting the bottom. I don't know. I think that it might keep it cleaner. I don't know. I'm gonna pour in the butter. I melted this in the microwave ahead of time. So there you go, butter. Okay, now I'm going to add 3 scoops of Keto Chow. In this case, I'm going to use the chocolate. Chocolate's interesting. I'm also going to be mixing up tonight some raspberry cheesecake with butter, snickerdoodle, chocolate toffee, which I think is going to be really good, and some of the creamy tomato basil that is not out yet. Don't even bother asking. We're still waiting on the protein powder, the beef protein, but it is coming. And I've got a prototype, and I'm using it during my 100 days of Keto Chow right now. So I'm going to use chocolate. Now chocolate, like I said, is interesting because it has cocoa powder in it. And the cocoa powder, it's one of the few flavors of Keto Chow that actually separates if you mix it up hot after it cools off and sits. And that's just because of the cocoa powder. So when I mix these up, all the other flavors like chocolate mint, salted caramel, when you put them in the fridge with the butter, they don't separate. after it cools. But chocolate does, but it does that regardless of whether you use avocado oil or heavy cream or whatever, if you use warm water. And that's just because of the cocoa powder. It's kind of weird, you just shake it up and it's fine, but it tastes amazing. Buttery chocolate. So anyhow, so I've got the butter and the warm water in here. So I'm just going to do 3 level scoops. I've got a scale out. I could weigh the amount, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to do scoops. So I'm leveling them off. Then I'm going to pour in the rest of the warm water and hit it with an immersion blender. Okay. Pour in some of the water. And just the way that my immersion blender works, I'm not going to put in the full 2 quarts just yet, and I'll show you why. So, hit this with the immersion blender. It's going to make a lot of noise, sorry. And now, I've usually got a bunch of stuff stuck to my immersion blender. That's why I kept out some of the water. So I'll use this to dislodge the extra stuff. Now I'm going to go around the outside of my water pitcher, getting all the stuff that's stuck to the sides. So, excuse me for a minute. And I'm just going to mix it up again. And you don't even have to be using butter to mix it up with an immersion blender. I like this one really a lot because I can mix up quite a few meals at the same time, up to 5 in this particular water pitcher. And yeah, when you're measuring it, make sure you pull the immersion blender out because it usually raises the thing. Anyway, I'm going to mix this up just a little bit more, and then I'm going to pour it into these Keto Chow blender bottles. That's good enough. Then usually I'll just stick this in the sink really quick, because I usually wash it off in between each one. So, plus I'm doing all the same flavor. So if you're doing, well, if you're mixing up 2.1, the way that I mix it up, this little part right here, where the arch is on the blender bottles, that's about the right amount for splitting 2 quarts of liquid 3 ways. So, just loading that up. And it's, like I said, it doesn't separate, even when it cools off. I mean, you could drink this right now. One nice thing about doing it warm or hot is that you don't have to wait for the protein to dissolve. You could drink it immediately. Now you also don't, I'm using warm water, not hot water. If you use hot water, it tends to make the protein denature or kind of get clumpy. And I don't want that. I always make sure that before I put the caps on, that I've got a nice solid click. And since I've been doing this with the butter, I haven't had any problems with it being so hot that it makes the blender bottle pop open. So, I mean, there you go. I've got 3 mils of chocolate Keto Chow with butter in them. They taste absolutely fantastic. You can do the same thing with the savory chicken soup. You can do the same thing with, once it comes out, the tomato basil, the spicy taco, and the beef. And I'm gonna do the same thing with the snickerdoodle, chocolate toffee, and the other flavors. But that's how you do it. It really isn't difficult. It's just kind of wrapping your mind around, you mix it up warm, and you're going to be using either a blender or a blender bottle. And because you're mixing it up with the blender, or not blender bottle, the blender or immersion blender, it won't mix up. At least I haven't had success. One of our friends, Paul, is mixing it up using a blender bottle. But I personally haven't had very much success using just a blender bottle to do the butter. I just like to use either a blender or a immersion blender, but just because it mixes so well. But that's it. I'm going to go stick these in the fridge They'll be ready to go tomorrow, which is very fortunate. We have a very busy day, so I'll just be able to grab these out. Now you can consume them a couple ways. You can pour them into a mug and heat them up in the microwave and consume them that way. You can just drink them straight out of the fridge cold, and the butter isn't going to separate. It gives it a nice buttery flavor, and I mean, that's it. So thank you so much for joining me.